All right, React hooks. Introduction to React hooks. All right, I left the best to last, really, because if you're wondering, this is the special sauce, right? I would show you a picture of a Big Mac, but I don't know if you get sick or not. Anyhow, some people like Big Macs, but this is the special sauce. So let's just quickly go talk about React. So we're gonna not talk about React, talk about React hooks. Talk about hooks and why they're important. We're gonna do the component. You're probably sick of components by now talking about them, but this is what React is alone by itself. Remember, it's just a library that deals with components for UI, for user interfaces. But as we have come to know a little bit, there are some problems just when you're trying to build out a bigger application, right? And some confusing points, which hopefully hooks will resolve. So we're going to talk about just a components review, right? For those who may be new to what a component is. We have this concept of a functional versus class component. So recap. So on the left, we have the functional component, and it's basically all it is it's a React sorry, it's a JavaScript function. It's a JavaScript function that's no different here. It's a little bit different in the markup. You're actually calling React.createClass. And you can do this the same way. You can actually create a function constant and use create class and then render render it as you would a class. Actually, this is to be honest, this is probably not the best example, but as you can suspend reality and say that the left is a functional component and it's wrapped inside of a class here. I don't know what we're doing there. We're basically creating a class and we're rendering a wrapper around a function. It's kind of silly. Anyhow, on the right is a class component, which uses that class extends from React component, has the render, and so on and so forth to React. These are exactly the same thing, right? Why would you use the other, one or the other? Why would you use all that extra syntax, and get into inheritance and all that stuff? Because of some certain things you might need, such as state and lifecycle and all these kind of things that only the class component has. Again, because the functional component is just a JavaScript function. Component state and lifecycle, as I said. So, here you might want to do something with that greeter. You want to have a flag that gets tracked, that is loaded, and when the component mounts, which is mean when it loads up, it's loading up. Maybe it needs to go and fetch some data from some backend API. You need to at least let the UI know that it's loading, and maybe you put some type of spinner up or something like that. And then there's another lifecycle event that may happen. Let's say when a component did mount, or it has finished, or it's unloading or whatnot. Then you can basically like do you could do other things, right? You can whatever have you have a timer, you can clear it, whatnot. So anyhow, and then you have that state that can be reflected inside of that instance of the component, right? And then you can also have props and all these things. So the main thing with class components is you have something called state, you have something called lifecycle hooks, you extend from React component, you have all the features that a functional component doesn't have, previously has never had, right? Until the newer version of React, which is version 16.1 or whatever, they brought in some new concept that we'll get into this in a second. Because to be honest, you may have realized that you might have created some functional component that does some kind of small little UI rendering. Maybe it's a button click, a like button, or something like that. And somewhere along the lines, you realize you need state now to track those clicks, and then you have to migrate everything from a functional component to a class component. You gotta go through that whole process, and it takes time, and that's why some people have opted only to do class components. But wait, there is more. So again, to go through disadvantages now of just the class component. And there are some disadvantages. So disadvantage number one, if you've noticed, there's no auto binding. So if you've been confused by class components and they just don't feel right, I'm with you. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens here. So React components using ES6 classes no longer auto bind the keyword this, to non-React methods. So you have to do this weird kind of, instead of auto binding, you need to take that extra step inside the constructor, right? And you need to do this dot bind and bind those functions up. It's kind of a pain, you know, to be honest. And then sometimes you'll get this. So sometimes in the construction, you need to do, as for example here on the left here, this is on change. You have to say this on change dot bind this. If you don't do that, then it's a problem. So it's easy to forget that. It's easy for, and you wonder why. Why do I have to do this extra step? It's very confusing. I get it. And then you'll get this error here. It says untyped caught exception cannot read the property of set state of undefined. So you get this state here because you haven't bound it properly, and you know there's certain things going on here that you know that's confusing. It is. Disadvantage number two is single responsibility and multiple functions. You know, you have all this, you have all this logic going on inside of did mount and will unmount. You know, and it's basically, it's customized within those lifecycle methods. Sometimes when you have unrelated logic in those lifecycle methods, you get all these side effects going on that you're not expecting that can have happen. So that's another disadvantage there. Sometimes if you go to say fetch data, the data may not fetch right away, may not come back when you expect it because again, it's um, React does some of those batch updates with the virtual DOM, and sometimes it doesn't happen when you expect it to. This is a problem. Again, almost looks like callback hell, right? Deeply nested components. You end up having this big tree sometimes because you're managing state, you're reusing logic between multiple components. You have this wrapper hell because you're wrapping and wrapping and wrapping for deeply nested components. And more on this later on when we talk about context, why you do some kind of wrapping like this. Really, what you're trying to do is pass down props, pass down logic, state, all the way. If you notice, the whole problem with React, when you've been probably doing this, is the whole problem with state. Where do I keep my state? Do I keep it in this component, the child component? Well, what if I need that state? What if another component needs it? Now I have to lift the state up. I have to move the state up to the parent component now, right? So you have a list up there of say list items, and you need the child component to not only modify that state, but also there's another component that needs to modify that. Okay, so do I need to move my state up even further up to like the app component layer and push it down? Like, so you run into all these problems when you're dealing with all these components, and this what ends up being very confusing. And to be honest, initially I didn't like React because of this very point. I'll get to that in a second. So functional components. So now we're going back to this plain old functional components. What were their disadvantages? I like them because they're so easy. They're so easy to test. That's an advantage because they're very small, lightweight. You can use something like Jest to test it because they're just a function at the end of the day. So disadvantage number one, of course, there's no state. There's no life cycle. So all we got is we just got props, and that's all we got. It's static, right? It's read only. You may put your own logic inside there, but it's not going to remember, you can't react to changes in the state of the component. Again, deeply nesting. Many wrappers to add props like we talked about before. The other example is more with state, but here's props because we need to pass it down. We're drilling down, prop drilling down all through these nested child components. It's a problem. But what if we told you that functions can have state? What if that's almost like if you ever saw the Matrix when he says, "What if I told you that you're the one," or "There is no spoon," or whatever the line was. I don't even remember now, to be honest. Whatever he was trying to say, get him out of the real world is not whatever it was, right? You remember that movie? It was all cool. But it blew your mind, right? So this is the point. This is going to blow your mind because now you can actually look at a functional component and you can use something called hooks. And hooks will give functional components state, which blows your mind. I actually didn't like React because of this point. I didn't like React because of all the class components. I just didn't like it. I didn't like the fact you had to do all this crazy prop drilling. It wasn't for me, right? Angular, remember, I was very pro Angular because Angular has dependency injection and your service can be a singleton and you can inject it everywhere and it has state and it just all felt really really warm and fuzzy and it felt great and I just like that. So but anyhow, I'm starting to very much warm up to React now that I'm getting used to hooks. So React 16.8, my mistake, I said 16.1, they let you use state. with other React features without having to write those class components anymore. Right, so the basic ones we'll just look at today are just these 3 basic ones that you'll use a lot, which is use state, we're talking about state, use effect, use context. There's a bunch of additional ones like reducer and callback and memo and all these things like that. I look into them, right? Reducer obviously uh, relates to Redux and having a reducer. Again, that's very big memory management for big applications, right? Not for what smaller applications we're doing, right? That would be a little bit of overkill for our purposes. And then there's a whole bunch of custom hooks. So it's really cool. Let's take a look at the use state of hook. Now this one will, you know what? I think this one's the most. This is the most useful thing you can have, to be honest, right? The state hook lets you have state in that function that you wrote without using the class. So now you can just go and say import React, use destructuring, use state from React, and then you have that use state there. And what you need to do is, let me just use my laser pointer here. So you have a counter. So before we had to use, you remember that example where we needed, and I'll show you in a second, we needed a class component. But here we have this kind of destructuring here set up here. So we determine this. We set the value, which is counter, and we set the function that's going to update the counter, that's going to update the state. And we use this state hook, and we default the count, this variable. It doesn't matter what it's named. It could be named, it could be named Neo for all we care, right? And we set that to 1. So now we have this setup, and inside of our JSX, we can output this count, and we have a button that has an inline function that sets the count. So we're using the set count, and we're modifying internally. It's modifying state, however it does it, to +1. And then when we do it again, this will change to 2. Click it again, it'll change to 3, and so on and so forth. So we have the concept of state without having to use the this keyword, without having to use this dot set state in the constructor and all those kind of things, right? We have state in functional component. That should blow you away, to be honest. Let me just, if it doesn't, well, tough audience. Let me just bring up an example quickly. All right, so we got this class component, and we've seen this example before, and we have counter. And all we want in this counter is as we click it, this component is self-maintained, and as it is being clicked, and as its internal state is being incremented, then React is smart enough with the virtual DOM to pick up the change and only update and re-render this component, right? We already understand that. But we need state. So how did we do it in the past? And this would be, a lot of code, to be honest, to do what we need to do. We need to create a class, ES6 class, extend from that parent component, the super component is React.component. Inside of that super class is such a thing called this.state and set state internally, and there's also lifecycle hooks. So what we need to do is we need to have this constructor. We need to add props. We also need to follow the pattern of passing props up to the parent component, which is React.component. And then we need to initialize state inside a component. So we're saying this dot state. We need to keep track of that, this dot state, and we need to put inside of there the item we want to keep track of, which in fact is a count, and we're defaulting it or setting it to 0. So we need already here. We have to do a lot of setup here. We have to do some initialization in a constructor, manage the super, the super constructor, the super class, then use this dot state, and then have some JSON object literal with a key value pair. It's already a lot of initial work just to manage an integer for counting, right? Then we have this render, right? We have that render, which is a method, and we need to return some JSX. And if you notice in here, obviously we have our parent tag, and we always have to say this.state.count. So we need to keep track of that in this evaluation. All right, that's fair enough. We have an inline function that, again, uses this.setState, and then inside it modifies this JSON object, and you got to keep track of it. It's a JSON object, and it's a count. And the previous count now is this new count, which is +1. So just to do this already, it's a lot of code, to be honest. You know, I mean, and especially if you're adding more to this, like you're adding Axios and getting list data or tracking, some user input. Like this can get a very big method for what it needs to do. So already we got a lot of code, and it's not exactly straightforward. I understand it because of all of this. So when you look at the React hook now to just use a functional component, you get rid of a lot of lines of code. Let's just quickly look at this. Right, so now we have this exact same thing. If you notice, it's a lot cleaner now. And we don't have much setup going on here. So if you look at this, first thing we need to do is we need to say import use state from React. All right, and this is instead of the constructor, instead of all this setup, we are doing it in one line. We're declaring a new state variable, which we'll call count. So that's a new state variable. Then we have the mechanism to update that state variable, and we are setting it default to use state. Which is the hook. So now we're setting up the hook, and we are setting the value of count to 0, and that's it. That's it. That is the hook that hooks into state somehow. That gives this component now has state just because of that statement. And all we need to do now, we don't have to worry about this dot keyword. We don't have to do this dot state. We don't even have to do this dot state dot whatever it was, right? To set it, it was this dot. I even forget this stuff because, to be honest, it's a lot of digging around with this, and and you have to get the brackets right and all this stuff. So this whole statement here, this dot set state equals count dot this dot state dot count plus, like, all that. You know what, like, you can just replace all of that right there with just set count plus 1. That's it. So you have 2 lines of code here. You got this setup, and you got this to set the value, and then all you're doing is outputting it, and that's all you need. And look at how much cleaner that looks, to a beginner or whatever. Looking at, like, I would actually, prefer to learn this and not have to learn the other one, but you need to go through the pain of that other parts to appreciate this. Because now it's like, why would I want to do a class component? Why? I mean, there may be some needs to do it, but I would just opt to do functional components and just use hooks, right? I mean, unless there are some other features inside the class component you really need. But you know what? If you need state and life cycle, we got you covered now. Not meaning me. React got Facebook, Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg has got you covered for all this stuff, right? So that's amazing, right? Now it works as expected, right? So I'm impressed. I like it. So the next one was, again, we're just focusing on these 2 ones you're going to use a lot. The other one is called, where can I click this? The effect hook. And I already got some spelling. He effect hook. It's supposed to be the. So the effect hook lets you perform side effects and functional components, which means it lets you have life cycle in a functional component. I mean, how great is that, right? And basically, this example here, we'll look at this. We did talk about a clock. So this is kind of going back a bit. So you can have a function, a clock, and you get an interval, whatever it is. You do our setup here with use state, so we're kind of mix and matching. Set a time, a set time, a use state with the date. And inside of there, we'll see this working. What we're doing is we are using this use state, and we'll make a comparison. What's that doing is that's hooking into the component will mount and the component will unmount. So basically it's saying when it will mount, it kicks off this interval that sets the time, that goes through and calls set time right there. It's maybe a little not clear right at the moment. So this will actually call this internally. We already talked about set state. We know all that. Basically, this new hook that we are using from React, which we're pulling in, is doing that whole will lifecycle mount and unmount and call internally what we want to call. So basically we have life cycles. So let's quickly look at that example. All right, so this is what I'm trying to tell you. I'm going back to, again, class components, and we are extending from React component. We have this whole constructor thing set up. We're doing super props, and we are setting the date. So we are setting up this initial state. Then we got these 2 lifecycle methods. They're not hooks yet because we're in the class component. Component did mount, and component will unmount when it unloads. And then we have some ticking mechanism that sets the state. So this dot set state, and again our object date dot, again already it's not exactly clear what's going on here. And then we are returning the value of this dot state dot date dot to local. So we have to dig into it like 3 levels down. This dot state dot date, right? Say that like 10 times. All right, we're rendering this into the React render, and we're mounting it. So the clock, this is our clock. So what will happen when it mounts? It kicks off a timer. Every second it calls this tick dot tick, which is this. So then every second it goes this dot state date equals new date. So it's just incrementing the new date, which is ticking every second. And and then it'll render that, it'll make that change. React will be smart enough to pick up the status change. We render the component with a new date, giving us the impression that it's ticking down. And then, of course, when the component end mounts, it just clears the interval out so it's not running indefinitely. Already, like that, I mean, there's a lot of code in there. You have to kind of understand what's going on there. Again, now we're going to use 2 hooks, 2 for the price of 1. We're going to use state and use effect, and we're going to do this exact thing in a functional component. And I bet you it's going to be small, a lot less code. So there it is, right there. So much cleaner. And now you can kind of like it looks, maybe this method in here looks a little bit convoluted, but you know what? Look at the amount of code. That's it, and that's ticking. It's crazy, right? Compared to the other one, if you look at how many lines of code there is almost double, right? For us to get that same amount of work. So inside here we have destructuring, we use state, use effect. We have our functional component. We do the setup, right? We're setting up the time. We already understand that, and we are outputting it down there. We're not doing this dot state dot time. We just are saying time. Time is a local variable. We have the mechanism to set time, which sets the state, and we will write it up to use state hook. So now we have this new use effect. Use effect on. So on load, what I'm doing is on component will mount, which is this whole thing here. Inside of that, I am wrapping the set timeout. Inside of there, I am just calling the set timeout set time to the local date, and that's updating. It's smart enough to know that this value here is going to be basically set the time. It's going to do this whole thing here is done in one line where we are this dot set state and date equals new. As soon as I pass that value into the method, it looks and it knows that it needs to update time. So 1 line, 2 lines for the state, and then we wrap it all inside of a use effect hook, and we basically have exactly what we had gone through all the pain of trying to figure out and learn what all this syntax meant and how to track state, right? So this is the secret sauce. This is why we went through the pain a little bit like that. So just hold on for 1 second. I'll bring up the next one. So really, if that didn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. So it's almost like Keanu here walking away from an explosion. Like you're blown away. Now, in terms of React and programming, anyways, I mean, when I saw that, I was a bit blown away. If you didn't notice, I actually made a reference to John Wick and The Matrix, because if you don't know, there's a fan theory going on that John Wick is in The Matrix, and and Neo is John Wick, and so on and so forth, and all this crazy stuff. I can't talk to anybody else about movies, so like I have to at least talk a little bit about this. So anyhow, I don't know why I just like the explosion in the background. So there's more. I just want to do one more hook. So I promised that I would talk a little bit about context API. We're not going to get into it too much detail, but again, this is precursor to hooks. This is attempt to before hooks. Again, we always had a problem with state in React. That's one of the problems when you start building applications. You realize, where should my state management be? I have no idea what's going on. I cannot. Someone asked me the other day, when I navigate back, I lose everything, right? Of course, because your components re-rendered, the state is lost. The parent state doesn't know, data is lost. So they had initially started to do the context API internally, and what it is it's, and I'll just read the definition here. designed to share data that can be considered global for a tree of React components, such as things like logging, theme, preferred language. So we'll look at the next slide, but basically it's a way of sharing state across a number of child components in a tree, solving our problems again, with this kind of preventing prop drilling and this kind of crazy stuff where you have state at some level and you have the event kind of backing up and trying to, you have props going down and events coming back up to try to re-trigger things, and like it just gets really messy, right? Those patterns, again, why I didn't like React at first. Then you see some of this newer stuff and you say, like, okay, now I can work with this, right? So this example here, it uses this create context, this hook. Okay, so we create this time context. So now I'm just quickly showing you how to set up the hook. I'll get into what the context API was in the next slide, but just keep in mind what this is. It's creating a time complex. So I think we all have that now with being inside so much. So time context. So we're creating a context of this date, new date. It's the current time, and we're going to export this time context with the current date and time. But I just wanted to basically show you what the context API looked like, and what it looked like. Again, it was a way to pass data through components without having to pass props down manually at every single level, and then of course try to get those prop values out with events. So really what it is it looks like, if you remember the navigation bar, if you remember the the browser routers, how you had to wrap everything uh, inside of that browser router. So therefore, anything inside of all those child components now have access to the browser navigation, the router. This is the same way. You have a context, and it's at the top level. So this could even be at the app.config. Sorry, app.config, the app component, and you wrap inside of the root tag. You wrap your context around all the child contexts, and then that would give context. That would give your entire application access to the date and time. And that's what this is. It's context API. It's a way to give context to all components, or select few. Here we have a time context, and we're using dot notation customer, but we are giving we're wrapping this entire thing in a container that can then be used as this child component analog clock will have access to the time that was set in this context, which, if you remember, if we look back, is this time context here, which is the new date. So that's kind of what that does. And we're not getting into the context API too much because we're using hooks now. So we're basically saying, I already know what that is. I understand that it's there, but we're just bypassing that. We're bypassing this wrapping mechanism, and we're going to just say, okay, here's a context that was created. This slide probably should have just been called context, to be honest. I'm setting a new context, and we're just saying, okay, yeah, I know what that is, and then we're moving on to this hook, which is called use context hook. So already, if you look at that, you can see right there, it gives functional components an easy way, again, to access your context. So now we have a functional component that has the context API in it. We're not wrapping it in this crazy mechanism here with class components and doing this crazy wrapping. We're basically we are using this use context. We're passing in that time context. Why not just throw in another one, which is called theme, and we're using a clock? But the point is, we have time, use context as that time context. So now we have, wherever that's set, that date, we're passing this state around everywhere we want, and we just need to output the time, and that's it. So you can imagine you set that context up somewhere and you pass it around. You could be at the very root level of a tree and call that context, and none of its ascending nodes or parents will even know about this context. So you can give it context, and it will know of some value that was set way at a high level, maybe at the top of your application. How beautiful is that? You're hooking into it. You don't have to pass props all the way down, multi levels, 10 levels down, all this stuff, worrying about that again. So, again, another beautiful hook, right? So, when you truly look at this now, and you look back maybe at the code that you wrote or what you've done, you're going to be like, okay, now I understand. Maybe, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, you might feel like you might need to go back and clean it up or rewrite it. But in the end, you'll be glad that you did. And then you'll have an understanding of what to do next time when you go to start doing a real life project. You'll be like, I'm using hooks right out of the box. I know about the other stuff, but you know what? I can get this done faster now. So, couple rules, 2 slides, I think, and we're done. I think, or maybe this is the last slide. Yeah, last slide. All right. So, just the rules to know before we let you go. Hooks can be used only in functional components. That's it. They're not for class, right? We're getting rid of classes. We're just using, not literally, but we are opting to say, if I like functional components and they're small and they're great, just use hooks in them. You don't want to use a hook in another hook. You don't want to use state instead of use state. That'll be a little crazy or whatnot, or you don't want to really use it too much like in that way. It's not class based. Hooks must be created in the same order, so you don't want to be using them. They must be outside of loops, conditions, and other nested functions. You don't want to mix and match in there. And then the final rule: hook names are always prefixed with use. So if you create a custom one, you always have to use used in front of it. It could be use matrix, use whatever. Um, John Wick, whatever. So anyhow, that to recap, this was just an eye opener about how to manage state. Now we're giving you hooks. This is the final piece of this puzzle that we're working on. And we showed, how powerful they can be and how useful they can be, and how now you can look back at your code and maybe reduce it a lot and just get that functionality back that you're hoping, and maybe get some love for React. Maybe it won't be as hard as it seems now when you look at this. I hope so. I hope this helps you out, and you know what? We'll talk again real soon. And thanks a lot for listening. All right.